Hello and welcome to comment response video for the French interwar carrier aviation. And start off with, I'm going to make a little bit of an announcement about Twitch. Now, it is never a good idea in life to be solely dependent upon one thing for anything. It's always good to have a backup option. And recently this has been highlighted to me in the case of YouTube because I have been toying with the idea of doing some live streams where I am using the various modded, well, let's be honest, computer games that I use as simulations for various things when I'm trying to test out theories to try and see if there is something something that might turn up, which I haven't realized, i.e., when I use things like Harpoon, etc. What I have found is when I've done, and these have been private, so I haven't shared them publicly, I've just been testing them out. When I've done the mods on the computer, even the new computer, the very cool, lovely computer, which has oodles and oodles of RAM and a very big graphics card and all the stuff you can possibly throw at it, and a very nice CPU designed to do everything I needed to do, and maybe possibly mildly overclocked. Even when I do that, and putting it through in the graphics which YouTube now prefers, it doesn't like it. It causes stuttering. And you always have to remember that basically when you have the mods running on top of a game, you're basically running a simulation on a simulation. So, especially when it's not sort of mods which are, how do I put this, adding a little bit thing into the game, like sort of in Timberborn if you have the train mod running, which is fun, by the way. Model trains trains running around in Timberborn does create a lot of fun. But you can end up being a little obsessed with building the railways, okay? Just leaving that one out there and end up forgetting all about the fact you're supposed to be supplying the beavers with water and food to make them grow, and you're just concentrating on your needs of your railway. Yeah, that can cause an issue. But leaving that to one side, what I have found is when I broadcast games on Twitch, it works okay. So far, my Twitch account, despite the fact Armchair Admirals and I usually talk from it, has exactly one follower. So that one person, I hope you've enjoyed the games I broadcast. But so to try and give it a regularish content, I will put out me playing normal games and answering naval history questions while doing it, just when I can. So it has something going up there, some kind of activity most weeks. But some weeks those games will be the modded things where I'll be doing testing and I'll be happy to answer questions whilst running through the simulation. And so that's what I'm going to be doing on Twitch. And it would be no more than probably one, maybe two videos at maximum a week. They won't be scheduled, but when they pop up, if you're free, if you want to come ask me questions, you're more than welcome to. That's all because I could possibly get away with running Ultimate Admiral Dreadnought and YouTube on this computer and doing it live, and that would work. In fact, that would work. But when I managed to get Harpoon downloaded and sorted out, and I managed to get the mods running on the new computer on the new version of Harpoon, which has all the Steam stuff around it, which did create some fun. When I then tried to do that with XSplit running and turn that into a live production onto YouTube, A, I realised I probably needed about a third screen. B, and I don't have space for a third screen on my desk unless I start doing the weird thing where you stick them, you know, like that, and that just looks weird to me. I know there are legitimate reasons to have a screen which is that shaped, especially if you have a chat thing open to go down and read it, and I can understand that to people doing that, and I am tempted sometimes by getting one of those micro projectors and putting the chat up on the wall and just reading off the orange wall next to me. But leaving that small weird fantasy to one side, not really my thing. And not really something I have space for, considering my desk is a 1950s style teacher's slash lecturer's desk that I acquired about 20 years ago, it must be, from a skip out the back of Kingston University. They didn't need it. Checked with the technicians. Was there visiting my sister. They didn't need it. Put it on the top of a car, strapped it down, got it home. I was an industrious 15-year-old, and I had a very up for it, at that point, father. And grandfather, who helped. But no, it was fun. But yes, it's not exactly a desk designed for, even though I have modified it slightly over the years, the drawers have now gone. So it's got space for my computer, etc. Although now the computer doesn't sit in the drawers, it sits on the fridge. We'll leave that to one side. There are other things which sit in that space. But yeah, it's not exactly designed for multiple, more than, but it's got 2 screens on it pretty much now, and that's pretty much taken over the entire desk. It works. Now, so basically that is a case of, if you want to watch them, you're more than welcome to, and just follow me on Twitch, and you get alert when it goes live. And the process will be literally, I am playing this game. If you want to ask questions, please ask questions about naval history. I can chat naval history while doing pretty much anything. And trust me, not the most recent, but a couple of former girlfriends ago, that was not considered necessarily an advantage. But we're still friends, so we'll leave that to one side. somehow, despite that. Oh, yeah. Can you distract me, or can I keep talking naval history? That was not a good bet to make. So, French naval aviation. Now, actually, I have to admit again, most comments were not on the French naval aviation video, but they were on a comment response video. And I've said before, I'm not doing if I do a comment response video to a comment response video, then that's getting far too meta for my tastes. That's getting to beyond the point of which that feels like I'm just having one long conversation. And I almost feel like at that point I should go, right then, we're going to do a Discord thing, and I'm still not sure how to run those. The Discord lives. I've got to figure that out at some point. Or we've got to do some sort of something else so that we can just talk this through in a conversation and do a more seminar style experience where it is more of an interactive conversation. The Discord thing looks like a viable option for that. But yeah. I'm thinking about this. I'm working on this, and as I become more and more and seem to be finding myself heading just through many ways through simplicity, but also through the realities of academic life at the position I am in, where I am now too senior for the early career and junior posts, apparently. I literally have been told that when I applied for them this year. But I am not senior and not a tenured academic, so not able to go for the senior posts or the late career fellowships, apparently fellowships. So I am stuck in the middle. I find myself more and more becoming a sort of independent historian, where my primary reliable income streams are YouTube, thanks to your support, are books, especially, this one's out, but the Kindle ones I hope will do quite well as well, and TV work. And they are far more reliable than all the traditional teaching I do, in terms of I not only guarantee the hours, but I can project them, and I can work it out, and I can plan in terms of time allocation, and I don't get cancelled on at random points, and I don't get paid and they go, oh well, we forgot to factor in these 2 weeks worth of pay in this paycheck, but don't worry, we'll give it to you next month. And they don't seem to understand that that doesn't really work that well. Not sure why. So as I do more and more of this, and I enjoy this more and more, and it becomes more and more a substitute for my teaching fix in some respects, I am trying to figure out ways to do more to give myself more of the teaching experience, but also give back more to all of you, because you make this possible. Anyway, into the French naval aviation. So, let's start off with the live. Hill Van Lent. Yes, why be that cruel to the French? They were, after all, the largest private supplier of ships to Nelson's navy. Show some respect. Nights ago from yeah, France being bankrupt does not help. No, it doesn't. It never helps with France. But honestly, the French have a fairly they try hard, and you have to remember that after the burn is built, they do try to get a new carrier. They do try to get another carrier built, and that's why they end up with a seaplane carrier, because the government decides it's too expensive, and they actually end up spending more buying the seaplane carrier than they projected they'd have spent buying the carrier, because they were around so long. Miles Jenkins, thank you, Jack Ray. Was just watching this when I heard my name. Happy birthday, mate. Very nice comment. Arian Contreras, I still can't wrap my head around that the Germans decided to look to the French, of all people, when it came to carriers. I know you said it in the German-French carrier video, but it's still weird. Yep. However, whilst there are many other models to pick from, the Italians and the Soviets both follow the Germans, so theoretically, if all three had built carriers, then 4 of the 7 carrier operating navies would have been using the French-style system. And let's be honest, if that had come to place, that would have been after, probably by about World War II would have had to not start till about 1942. You would have probably had a maximum of 8 to 10 carriers in service using that system. So probably Britain would have had 8 to 10 carriers in service. The US Navy would have had 8 to 10 carriers in service. The Japanese would probably have had about the same, but would have had about the same by 1942. The British might have actually even had more, because they'd have had Ark Royal, Courageous, Glorious, Furious, were all scheduled to be sort of kept. Eagle was probably going to hang around for a bit longer, but it will still be around by 1942. Illustrious, Victorious, Indomitable, Formidable, Indefatigable, Implacable, and Unicorn Sister. And the odds are they'd have ordered another strike carrier of some kind at some point during that thing, or another Unicorn, so probably about 14 for the British. I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans were about the same by about 1942. So yeah, basically there would have been less. Any of the three major carrier operating powers would have operated more aircraft carriers for their nation alone than operated the French system, but more powers would operate the French system. We also can then get to the idea that there could be a Soviet, German, Nazi Soviet fight in the Baltic, with both using aircraft carriers of the Graf Zeppelin type. We can think about that as a theoretical warfighting scenario. Under that scenario, they possibly could have also been carrying similar air groups. That's... And also a fight in the Mediterranean between French and Italian carriers. There is part of me which wonders if the world war that actually would emerge in that 1942 scenario would be the other navies, the Royal Navy, the American U.S. Navy, and the Japanese Navy banding together to wipe out those navies who think that's a sensible carrier design from the Earth. It could be a wholly different world war, literally based on, we don't like you, but we are worried for the fate of humanity if they are allowed to continue to have carriers and produce. So we will deal with that threat to humanity first, before we deal with you being annoying. I'm, of course, being facetious, but it does offer a very interesting perspective. There's also the fact that if the Russians have a carrier, the Japanese then can again have full, basic justification for their own construction, without anyone in America really being able to be able to say no, 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 you can't, because the Japanese can go, how many times have we fought wars against the Russians? Literally, how many? Okay, yeah. Ethan McKinney, most important feature of the French political system, losing a no-confidence vote did not force a new election. This encourages intrigues amongst the parties and constant scrambles for power in the quest for new alliances to form a government. It also makes it extremely stupid in terms of long-term planning. Before we go, I brought this up in chat but wasn't able to stick around. I noticed French light cruisers had aviation facilities with hangars. The heavy cruisers simply had a catapult with no hangars. I assume the light cruisers for colonial work and the heavy cruisers for Mediterranean? Pretty much. Also, the French have that gorgeous, gorgeous seaplane, the Commandante Teste, which I've already discussed was originally planned to be an aircraft carrier, but then they said they didn't want to spend that money, so they ended up taking time building it, and it comes out more expensive than they actually planned aircraft carrier would have been. It's a funny ship with 2,500 nautical miles range at 10 knots. The thing sort of looks like a modern LHD. I'm guessing that she could move a regiment or more, able to carry 26 seaplanes. One thinks she was a major component of French carrier thinking, especially as she was launched in 1927, when the capabilities between seaplanes and land-based aircraft were not as distinct as it would be in the coming decade. With a range that low, it seems unlikely that she would be doing colloidal work. Honestly, it was unlikely she'd be doing anything. The thing with Commandante Teste, to my experience, think more about her something as a portable mobile naval air base, okay? She will turn up somewhere, set up, and then do operations from there. So don't think of her as a ship out with the force. Think of her as something that goes from island to island, setting up a naval airbase. Nicole Ross, Dr. Clarke, I believe you don't understand tree math. 22,000 plus 25,000 plus 25,000 equals 60,000. I really don't, because according to my math, that equals 72,000, but you know. Treaty math. Nicholas, didn't the French conceive of combat or operational losses? They did, but it was a kind of, how do I put this politely? They have a similar issue with the French Ministry of Aviation as the Royal Navy and, to an extent, the Royal Air Force have with the Air Ministry in the UK. In that the Ministry has this very fixed idea on what air power will be, And the Air Force and the Navy, who actually need the air power at this point, are going, no, air power's more complicated than that. It is one of the interesting things. I would say that, to my mind, and this is also the case in the Admiralty, but in a way the Admiralty managed to keep them under control more because they could always post them away around the world onto ships, so they could re-navalize them. Whereas the most you can do with a very politically inclined officer in the Air Ministry is post him to an airbase in the UK where he's not that far away from the politicians he wants to chat with, and imagines he's able to. He imagine that that he's sort of wants to interact with anyway. Plus, the Air Ministry, in many ways, is a victim of its own success, because the Air Ministry is so worried about it getting deactivated, about losing the political fight for its own survival, that it gets overly political and is almost too successful at putting the case forward for what it sees as its greatest strength to survive, the strategic bomb project. And at certain points, it's even caused some people to view the ideas of getting rid of the fighter corps. If you can imagine that, if some of the proposals to get rid of fighter command, etc., had gone through in the... They never reached Parliament, but there's various people talking in sort of papers and the press, etc., talking about it in the early 1930s. Britain could have been royally up the creek without a in World War II. And that was all based on the bomber will always get through mantra, which was pushed by the Air Ministry largely because A, they believed it, but B, they believed it was also the best guarantor of an independent Air Ministry and therefore their own roles. In fact, it dovetails so nicely is fun. Eddie from McKinney. The Air Naval had more of a naval aircraft development program than you might expect because it operated similarly land-based and planes and float planes. The trouble is they're part of their, to an extent, Air Ministry and controlled. This substantially increases the purchase of several types. Even for limited runs, you still get specialised aircraft like Levasseurs. As with the Fleet Air Arm, they also made use of navalised land planes, the D-373 being the obvious example. Ultimately, the Air Naval's aircraft did not fall behind because of neglect, but because the entire French air arsenal fell behind. Honestly, the problem you're into with that, and that's a problem which the Royal Navy faced, but they had a slightly different setup, so they were slightly more lucky than the French Navy. In that the development of aircraft carriers and the aircraft go hand in hand. As aircraft get heavier, that's when you change from having longitudinal to latitudinal bracing of the wires, the arrestor cables. That's as aircraft develop, and unless you have views in both sides, you get into trouble. Now, the Royal Navy's one advantage in this, which it did exploit mercilessly, was that a lot of the same companies which were developing aircraft were also involved in ships and in ship equipment. And the Royal Navy used this to try and get information in the back way. And the naval constructors and Third Sea Lords are the key to this approach. They basically spend their lives wandering around the various companies and asking questions. And this is why you can, in some ways, it gets muddied by refits, etc. But you can see possibly 3.5 generations of aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s. If you look at those aircraft carriers, you look at how they look in the first half of the 1920s versus the second half of the 1920s versus the first half of the 1930s versus the second half of the 1930s, you will notice the flight deck evolves, you will notice the aircraft handling systems evolve. Aircraft are evolving, but more importantly, the systems are evolving, and that's one of the reasons why they can do what they do in World War II, is because they're evolving the systems. And that is the thing. The French, for various reasons, don't have that option. And you need a certain... to have that level of capability, you do need a certain number of carrier-borne aircraft as well, as part of it. If I'm getting, from what I can tell, Navy had purchased the mixed propulsion plant for Normandy, but not purchased the different all-turbine set that the burn was designed for. Because of the shape of the hull, it appears that the all-turbine set for the burn would have used different turbine plants from the ones that were used when it was built. So aside from the much reduced range of an all-turbine plant, using the existing set also saved money. As I try to make a point of several times in there, the idea that the all-turbine plant would reduce range is not really true. Okay? You can make the case. But and compared to the turbines which the burn was supposed to be fitted with, probably you can make the case quite a little bit more strongly. But you can adjust turbine design, you can adjust turbine form, you can get the range, and if you most turbine sets, especially if you're using 3 turbine sets for the shafts, you could probably get, well, let's put it this way, the turbine sets as they become could probably have a, and that will give you the range. And that is technology which is there in the 1920s. And you're taking so long with burn anyway. Ethan, again. I've looked at an aircraft for some time now, and I've concluded that the specification for a twin-engine torpedo bomber was primarily due to a shortage of sufficiently powerful engines, which was the issue facing everyone at this point. The 1,000 horsepower engine doesn't work for a naval aircraft. It's one of those annoying things. It's kind of like the 10-inch gun. It sounds really good until you realise that the 1,000 horsepower engine on a sort of the Merlin 1,000 horsepower engine on a Spitfire Hurricane works really well, because all they have to take off with is basically the plane. Because if you consider a naval aircraft, we'll have to have a navigator in the back, because where are the navigation points? They're over the ocean. Especially in the pre-GPS, pre-radar, pre-all sorts of those things era. It gets an issue. Especially if you're thinking longer range. They'll have to have more life preservers and life aids, because again, they're not flying out over the ocean as an incident of where they're operating from on land. They're flying out of the ocean because they're surrounded by it. And then you've got the night flying aids and all those systems. So it adds up weight, which is why the 1,000 horsepower engine aircraft don't give the boost in capability that you expect. And at the end of 1953, the Curtiss XVS Helldiver flew with a 700 horsepower engine. By the time deliveries began in mid-1957, the SBC-3 mounted an 825 horsepower engine. By contrast, 1937 specification yielded the SAN CAO 600 with a pair of 680 Nomrone radials, and the one-time 750 with 500 horsepower Renault 12 RV12s. There is also a reason that you sometimes get lower powered engines in naval aircraft, which is you're going for reliable engines. Now, I would say multi-engine aircraft are also quite a capable thing for them to push for. Please note, there is a reason the Royal Navy are doing tests with Mosquitoes and Beaufighters, and would really have loved a twin-engine aircraft. And one of the interesting things that comes about is that later on you get quite a lot of aircraft, especially post World War II, which have combined air engines driving contra-rotating propellers. Of course, one of the most famous examples is the Armstrong Siddeley double Mamba turboprop engine, which is two Mambas driving contra-rotating propellers, and that of course is fitted to the Fairey Gannet. It's a really cool system. Why are twin engines so attractive to naval aviation? Yes, but even in that quite complicated contra-rotating gearboxed system, because of reliability. Because of the fact you are operating at long range. And that's another reason why those engines are possibly not the most powerful engines selected, from what I've looked into them, is because of the desire to keep the weight down. But, it's a fun thing. would something, as you mentioned, would something like a Whirlwind or Sea Mosquito be used for the aircraft for the Iron Carriers? Um, I'd look more at the Beaufighter and Blenheim sort of line, because they're the twin-engine aircraft actually in development. The Mosquito, when it comes about, is really cool. It was the first one tested, and eventually a design variation on it called the Hornet was used, so as a night fighter. So it could well be that line. It would be an interesting thing if, as said, if in the 1930s, early 1930s, the French had produced this. I wouldn't be surprised if you'd had a twin-engine aircraft tested on Ark Royal. If that had proved viable, then that would have led to a change in development of the Illustrious class. And the ones which came back afterwards, which could have actually been interesting, because they'd probably got higher hangars, wider lifts. Actually, they might have even got deck edge lifts. Because if you're... that would make sense for a twin-engine aircraft to go for a deck edge lift. Because that's the easiest way to get to minimise weight of lift, whilst getting maximum space for lifting the size of aircraft. So they might well end up going with deck edge lift aircraft. They'd probably still have the armoured hangar arrangement, but they'd have doors on one side to let them in, so they'd have that, but that would be an acceptable weakness. It could be kind of interesting, because if you think about the layout of an Illustrious class carrier, and you just move the two lifts to the island side, you'd have to move the air defense batteries, probably, but not that much. And oh well, actually no, you could keep them where they are, and you could just move the lifts slightly further in. And then you would have dead space either end of the hangar, which you could use for maintenance of aircraft. You'd have a through aircraft space for the aircraft to be maintained and repaired, and sort of, well, so that aircraft to be ready for flights. You could store aircraft off for launching, behind or forward with barriers. You could still work pretty darn well. That'd be a pretty darn efficient design. And you could get a twin-engine aircraft aboard. And what would the twin-engine aircraft do? Well, that's going to be the interesting thing, because, again, this is where some of the questions on the long recorded video, the Long Patrol, really do come in quite interesting. So, down money in, history out. That is pretty much my version of an economy. Down when dogs get smarter, they will learn to hit reorder on Amazon for bickets. Don't dispute that as a likelihood. Yeah. Already covered, though. We have no fighter command, we have no coastal command from the Air Ministry at times. The Air Ministry at times is at war with its own Air Force, let alone with the Navy. Decision. French World War I casualties. The scale is even worse when you think that of it as a percentage of the male age groups who went to war. The level of society range of that waste of a human life is quite understandable. Oren Tyler, with only a slight amount of hyperbole, it's fair to say France virtually lost a generation and was bled dry by First World War. With the institutional and societal impact that had, the multitude of factors that led to 1940 collapse are far more understandable. Yes. They've bled too much already. I think I said in a video recently that it's not World War One which destroys Britain and it means it can't run its empire. It's not the Great Depression, and it's not World War Two. It's all three. They could weather one, fine. They could any one of those. Two, they could probably still buck up. All three, there's no chance. It's the same with France. But the trouble is, World War One and the Depression was enough for France. That put them into all sorts of problems. Especially when you combine it with their political system and infighting. And the shit. If you'd had some governments actually stay in power for 4 or 5 years at a time in the 1920s and 30s, the French could have been in a very different state. Because there could have actually been some continuity on what was offered and what was delivered. But there wasn't. There just wasn't. Steve Clarke, Alex, just a quick thought. With the casualty statistics, you don't account for people with both physical injury and psychological issues in your accounting of statistics. So the situation is probably not as clear as set out, and unfortunate for the individuals with both problems. Yes, I did. And let me please explain the source. So, there was a presumption that anyone who was wounded would have some kind of psychological scarring. Sorry, but if you're wounded enough to be on the disabled list, you probably are. The odds are you're going to carry some psychological scarring. So that's one amount affected. Those people I was talking about were in addition to that group. In addition to that group. That's what the stats are about. It basically goes when you're looking at it, when you're looking at the sort of the various stats that go through. They goes, these people just have psychological trauma. These people have physical and probably psychological trauma. These people then are dead, basically. I'm sorry if I didn't explain that properly, but that's what I meant it as, and that's what I read the sources as. John Evans, based just on the title, if you had burned, you wouldn't embrace Higakara, is there either? Got to add this one to the backlog. Hope I can catch up soon. Hope you enjoyed. Just student. So, in an old history where war is delayed until 1943, did the Joffres lead to the sudden realization for the Marine Nationale, who then rushed to catch up? I think you're probably talking about the Regia Marina, i.e., the Italian Navy, not the Marine Nationale, because the Marine Nationale would have the Joffres, and they'd have two of them, so they probably feel that they were fine. For the Regia Marina, yeah, they'd have got something. At the moment, the Joffres were laid down, etc., and had actually looked like they were going to be launched. The Regia Marina were never going to let the French have aircraft carriers and then not have anything. To answer your question, I think that while the UK Ministry will be very interested initially, the poor performance of French aircraft will make the case that a larger number of smaller single-engine aircraft is far more effective for carrier operations. Okay. The UK Ministry, by this point, don't have a say. Let me explain that. By 1937, there's the INSCIP report, and the naval aviation is awarded fully to the Royal Navy. And it's a 2-year process, and by 1939 it has actually been fully transitioned across to the Royal Navy. However, as part of earlier agreements, by about 1933, the Royal Navy is now providing 70% of all pilots, 70% of all of the engineering ratings they are starting to try and provide, while they're working up to that, and they are increasingly involved in the specification of aircraft. This is what managed to lead to the skewer, because up until that point, the skewer, and the Royal Navy started to dress it up as a fighter dive bomber rather than just a dive bomber, because the Air Ministry were causing trouble in Parliament by saying it wasn't necessary. But the thing is, the Royal Navy could get what pretty much they wanted. And they were basing their requirements off their knowledge. But the trouble is they didn't have access to much of a knowledge base in terms of that. Because the Air Ministry weren't exactly the most forthcoming. Or rather, individuals were very forthcoming, but the people who were in charge of them weren't. You can often find very good, very conscientious people who are happy to share all the information necessary within the Admiralty. But the amount of information which gets shared quietly in the back of pubs. There is an interesting report I once read in one book, and I've never gone into the MI5 section to really check this, where the MI5 thought that there was an espionage operation being carried out in the Air Ministry and the Admiralty at one point in 1936, 37, because of what was going on, and because documents kept moving about, and they weren't going through the official channels. And then according to this thing I read, it was a book, but I'm not 100% sure on this. It's an informal history of MI5. in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. And it it says, according to this, it was found that it was junior officers circumventing superiors in the Air Ministry to help superiors in the Admiralty get the information they needed by just calling up their friends from school who were in the Air Ministry and going, "Do you want a pub lunch?" And they decided in the end it was actually a very effective espionage operation, but it's been carried out by the Admiralty on the Air Ministry for the prices of lunches. And whilst it was quietly suggested that it should shut down because of the security risk it did pose, it seems to have just been carried out slightly more discreetly. Instead of pub lunches in central London, a lot of them seem to have ended up having pub lunches in places like Headley and other parts of Surrey and some areas of St Albans, etc. instead. Paul Fishgano, ironically, the lines around Verdun didn't really work. The Germans were, as a result, only of poor leadership, unable to exploit their air power advantage into war-winning operations. They worked quite well. If you look at the trench map and the line of fortifications, yes, there are problems with it, but the line of fortifications and the trenches do sort of roughly correlate. Roughly. Jack Ray, if the French tried to use a twin-engine aircraft on a carrier of less than 20,000 tons, it would have gone poorly. However, it would reinforce the idea that it would be a bad idea to do so. The other navies would proceed with their plans and let the French be French. It's 18,000 standard tons on the Joffre. It's 20,000 tons in service, which is what they claim. But I would say this. The light fleet carrier, there's a 1942 design light fleet carrier, is 13,200 tons in standard and 18,000 tons fully loaded. So, how the Joffre class was going to be 18,000 tons in standard and only 20,000 tons in deep load, fully loaded, I do not know. I don't think that works. I would honestly say I would expect it to be about 23,000 fully loaded carrier. So, and I think it would work. I would also add that the reason I used the 1942 design light fleet carrier is, of course, HMS Ocean is used for the first jet landing trials with Eric Winkle Brown. And, of course, he landed twin-engine aircraft on Indefatigable. Let me just check that one. Yes, Indefatigable, Mosquito, in March 1944 aboard it. So, first pilot to land a twin-engine aircraft on a twin-engine fighter on an aircraft carrier in March 1944, and was then the first to land a pure jet aircraft at the H-100 Vampire on a carrier HMS Ocean in December 1945. If you want to be really brave, you think about the fact that in a Vampire in 1948, he pioneered the technique of landing an aircraft without undercarriage on a rubber-covered flexible deck on HMS Warrior in 1948. Every time I read that, I go, that's just scary. Eric Winkle Brown himself thought the idea had considerable merit. For some reason, it was not proceeded with, but the Admiralty were thinking of, that is an aircraft literally crashing into the deck of the carrier. It might be a rubber map, but it's literally crashing into the deck of the carrier. Yeah, no. Jonathan Smith, while twin engines, if the French had gone to work on a carrier, might have given them longer range on a heavier strike cover. I think you might have gotten carried away, saying it might lead to a multi-engine, multi-role aircraft. Or rather, such aircraft would have probably been even worse at fighter role than the USN dive bombers, which were sometimes pressed in the role of additional air defense. Again, Mosquitoes were very good fighters, bow fighters, very good aircraft. There's lots of twin-engine fighters in World War II. The Lightning was a very good was a twin-engine aircraft in World War II, which was a good fighter. Twin engines does not mean you're a bad fighter, an aircraft. Lots of people tried twin-engine heavier escort fighters in World War II, and none of them were all that great if up against single-engine fighters. It's not so useful to use some of your twin-engine aircraft to escort the others if you're not capable of keeping a single-engine capper over the target of the strike aircraft. if they're not capable of keeping a single engine cap over target off the strike aircraft. No, they usually can do that. Again, Beaufighters, Mosquitoes did this. They're fairly good as night fighters as well. It depends on your tactics. If you've got a big, powerful aircraft like that, you don't do dogfighting, twisting, turning. You do zoom and boom. Basically, come in, shooting, and then off out, and then come round again. You don't do twisty, turny dogfighting as a rule. You can do that in some of these aircraft. The Mosquito, when it was in its fighter form, could do all sorts of weird things. Not that I would personally recommend doing them in it, but you could. They're not the... I'm not going to claim they're the greatest fighter in the world, but they're certainly good enough, and you can use that. Again, there is a... Here is the thing. Let's go from perspective of this twin-engine aircraft is an 80% solution for all these roles. Now, I can carry on my carrier, let's say I can design it to carry 48 single-engine aircraft or 36 twin-engine aircraft. Okay, so I've lost 12 aircraft. But my 48 single-engine aircraft work out as 16 fighters, 16 dive bombers, and 16 torpedo bombers. And from those aircraft, I can maintain an 80% availability. So, on average, I will have available at any one time to be able to launch to operating from 12, maybe 13 fighters, 12, 13 dive bombers, and 12, 13 torpedo bombers. Okay, not bad. So I have 36 aircraft. And I can maintain, because I'm carrying all the same stores, all the people work on the same aircraft, all the fitters, etc., work to the same aircraft and all the same facilities. I can probably maintain a slightly higher operational capability. Not a lot more, but 85%. So, 8.5. And out of 10. So that means I end up with 25 aircraft plus 8.5, 6. So that's 4.8. 4.8. I probably end up with roughly 30 aircraft available at any one point. And I can use those as fighters, as dive bombers, or torpedo bombers. So, I can have 36 to 39 aircraft, but only 13 for each role. Or I can have 30 aircraft that I can shift between any of those roles. "13 fighters that can't be used for dive bombing and can't be used for torpedo bombing. 13 dive bombers that I really don't want to use for fighting but might be having them in my backup for fighters. And 13 torpedo bombers that can only really be used for torpedo bombing or reconnaissance. Or I've got a pool of 30 aircraft available. And, by the way, probably if I've got that and I'm based on bigger aircraft, I might well start designing my carrier to operate more bigger aircraft. What I'm saying is, you have to be careful with assumptions based on the development of technology as we see it, because once you make a small change, and this is something which, honestly, it would be a very fun what-if video to do at some point with Drac as a joint project, which would be look at what are the impacts if the Admiral class become aircraft carriers for the Royal Navy. Because I wouldn't be surprised if it is twin-engined aircraft that start to evolve from it. I wouldn't be surprised. because the Royal Navy's unlikely to get a lot of aircraft with the Air Ministry to fill them up in terms of space of single-engine aircraft, but so they might just try and fill them up by having bigger aircraft and see what they can get, because it's going to be big enough and large enough to do it. However, if they'd gotten twin-engine aircraft to service earlier, that might have put practical torpedo bombers on carriers a bit earlier than historic. Practical torpedo bombers were on carriers from pretty much the beginning. There is the Cuckoo, which is developed literally for Furious. And then there is the Blackburn Dart, which is a fairly decent torpedo bomber. They're around for quite a while. And one's hopefully large enough to carry torpedo internally for better top speed. Well, that would be nice, but that's going to be a long way away, because honestly, internal carriage of stores is something which comes later. Before single engines get powerful enough to hold a heavy torpedo and necessary fuel. It's not just the torpedo and the fuel, it's all the other gear. As I talked about earlier, it's the navigational equipment, it's the survival equipment, it's all the other stuff you need. It's the extra people. And being able to load such an aircraft with extra fuel in its bay and really good radio, you might get a pretty good scout in the fleet shadow. Well, twin-engine aircraft do have options for that. On the whole, though, having more bomb capacity might just tempt them into turning the twin-engine strike planes into medium-level bombers. Seems harder to stress such a plane for such steep diving. The result that might result in air wings less able to hit manoeuvring ships or smaller, harder targets. Sure, if it wasn't discovered pre-war, such carriers might do worse than historic ones. Now, if you could have invented both a carrier-capable medium bomber and a Fitzex guided bomber pre-war, again, Beaufighter, and Mosquito, and a fair number of aircraft which were developed, were used, were quite capable. I think you are taking it into the American medium bomber direction, which I can understand why you're going, but I was thinking more in terms of the light bomber, not medium bomber, which is probably where the British would have gone. And the light bomber strike aircraft was already quite the standard British idea for how they developed their aircraft, some of their aircraft for their carriers. The Heart, etc. The, oh good lord, the Fairy. A history and a half. Let alone the Fairy Firefly. It's all an interesting discussion. David Brennan, French politics of the era is best not unpacked too much or get used to the chair. Fascinating. But let's go. Twin-engine air question. 18,000 tons is too small to operate twin-engined aircraft effectively. The French probably would have been better off building several more of those interesting seaplane carriers they had, and this includes some actual range. Again, it depends on the size of air group you're wanting and what you want the ship to do. You have to remember, the French basically consider operating any air group in range of land-based aircraft to be suicide for that air group. So they are looking at operating far away from any bases, in which case, what are they using the aircraft for? Scouting and long-range strike. It works in theory. I'm not going to say it works in practice. I'm not going to say I would want this carrier in the Royal Navy, etc. I don't want to even watch it in the Marine Nationale. I want them to get something better. But I can see its rationale. Aaron Contreras, it's kind of scary how 4 nations might have used the French system for aircraft carriers of World War II. It had started 5 years later. Yeah. Ugh. Thank you, DH89. I know. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion. It was a fun topic to do. And, yeah, thank you for all your support. It wouldn't be possible, and I certainly wouldn't be in a position I am now, without you. Take care, everyone.